United States, Cuba, and Brazil were the last nations in the Americas to abolish slavery. The Civil War between 1861 and 1865 ended slavery in the United States. Spain had little choice but to begin dismantling of slavery in Cuba in the aftermath of the 10 Years' War, a violent rebellion for independence that raged from 1868 and 1878, in which abolition became a major issue designed to attract slaves to the revolutionary cause. Brazil, which held out for the longest, finally surrendered to abolitionism in 1888, mainly because of domestic and international political pressure, but without any major violence, as was the case in the United States and Cuba. Before slavery's abolition, the transatlantic slave trade had been gradually dismantled, mainly because of the British efforts to end first slaving and then slavery. The British-American Treaty of 1807 ended the slave trade to the United States and the British colonies in 1808. Britain, which took the international lead to exercising pressure upon both Spanish Cuba and Imperial Brazil, forced various accords to abolish the slave trade upon each country. These were largely ineffective. Spain signed treaties ending the Cuban trade in 1817 and again in 1835. In 1862, British naval patrols had been given free rein to search suspected slave ships flying any flag, including those of the United States, and this increased pressure upon Cuban slave trade. However, slaving continued until 1867 and the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War. Before Brazilian independence in 1822, British pressure on Portugal had produced treaties in 1815 and 1817. First, limiting the trade to Brazilian regions north of the equator, and then supposedly abolishing slave trade altogether. These were as ineffective as the Anglo-Spanish treaties. British pressure resulted in another anti-slaving treaty with independent Brazil in 1826. That was designed to ban the slave trade in 1830. In 1831, after the establishment of the Brazilian Empire, yet another law was declared supposedly freeing any slave entering the nation after that year. But the trade continued until heavy British diplomatic pressure, backed by British naval patrols off Rio de Janeiro's coast, forced Brazil to end slavery and the slave trade. End the slave trade in 1851. There have been many debates about what led to the rise and spread of abolitionism in Europe and the Americas, and eventually to the curbing of the slave trade and the freedom for nearly all slaves over the course of the late 18th and 19th century. The publication of Eric Williams' seminal book, Capitalism and Slavery, in 1944 was the catalyst for the intensive debate on the cause for the abolition of both the slave trade and slavery. Before what has become known as the Williams thesis, which focused on economic explanation, the rise of anti-slavery sentiment was interpreted as part of a broad changes in attitude among philosophers, religious leaders, and eventually masses of people who succeeded in influencing political leaders to enact laws and exert international pressure, leading to the end of slave trade and slavery. Their motives were said to have been conditioned by major shifts in ideas focusing upon humanistic and moral questions that parallel the rise of rationalism and democratic political systems in Europe and the United States. Most important for us to remember is that slavery had existed in all cultures and was philosophically, ideologically, and politically accepted as part of a supposed natural order that governed the human experience. In the late 17th and early 18th century, however, outspoken objections to human bondage were coming from religious leaders, especially among Quakers in England and the United States. With the growth of rationalism, scientific knowledge, and the gradual spread of the Enlightenment's ideas on human liberty and freedom during the 18th century, the philosophical and religious justifications for racial slavery were undermined. England became the center of anti-slavery mass movement during the late 18th century, and gradually abolitionism was embraced by British political elites who led a militant international campaign to end both the slave trade and slavery. The interpretation that the growing tide of humanism, morality, and rationality produced the anti-slavery movement was, for the most part, a self-congratulatory history written by the abolitionists themselves. But it was by and large accepted by most historians through the mid-20th century. Williams, in his 1944 Capitalism and Slavery, asserted that morality and humanism had little to do with the rise of abolitionism and argued that the self-serving economic factors were behind Great Britain's anti-slavery policy during the 19th century. Williams maintained that slavery in the British West India colonies had become unprofitable after the successful American Revolution, and that the dominant slave-based sugar economy was experiencing crisis and decline in the early 19th century. Slavery was an obsolete form of labor, no longer economically sustainable, and wage labor was more productive and rational. Great Britain was the leading European economic and imperial political power, as well as the unquestioned center of the Industrial Revolution and the expanding world capitalist system. It was in its economic interest not only to end slavery and slave labor, but also to end it in the colonies and to force other European rivals as well as the United States to abolish slavery itself. If successful, this would lead to more rational and effective labor systems everywhere and greater productivity and profitability as industrial capitalism advanced. And these factors would help consolidate Great Britain's position as the world's premier economic power and imperial center. Williams rejected the notion that moral and humanistic considerations had anything to do with the rise of British abolitionism. Economic self-interest was the driving factor behind British anti-slavery campaigns of the 19th century. The Williams thesis was attractive to scholars examining slavery and abolition in the aftermath of World War II, when economic interpretations of historical processes became widespread and highly influential. In many ways, Williams' arguments were indeed logical, as abolitionism's rise in Great Britain occurred precisely with the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism and wage labor and the British imperial power were all expanding dynamically. However, if economic obsolescence and the declining profitability of slave labor were responsible for the rise of abolitionism, Williams presented little evidence to support his claim. By the late 1950s, historians began to subject the economic aspects of slave labor in Americas during the era of abolition to scrutiny. A body of literature on the internal economic dynamics of slavery gradually emerged that demonstrated that slave labor was extraordinarily efficient in most places and highly profitable from a purely economic point of view, the dreadful human barbarity of the slave system notwithstanding. Concerning the British colonies, it was convincingly demonstrated that Williams was wrong in stating that the West India sugar economies were contracting and confronting a crisis that led to the abolitionist movement. On the contrary, the colonial sugar economy was dynamic, expanding, and highly profitable, precisely as abolitionism grew and was consolidated in Great Britain. It was the abolition of slave trade in 1808 and then slavery in 1833 that caused a severe economic crisis in the Caribbean colonies. This finding was exactly opposite to Williams' conclusion on the economic aspect of slavery and abolition. If slavery was indeed economically profitable right up until it was abolished, then a renewed examination and explanation of the rise of abolitionism had to be rethought. Surely, one was that there was a return, sometimes reluctantly, to the idea of moral, humanistic, and religious imperative that abolitionists themselves had originally popularized. British and American Quakers, a small Protestant sect that emerged during the 17th century English civil wars, played the initial role in anti-slavery religious and political activism. In the 18th century, well before the American Revolution, Quakers in the future United States denounced both slavery and the slave trade. At their 1758 meeting in Philadelphia, members were forbidden to own slaves or to participate in any way in the slave trading. And in 1774, English Quakers voted to expel any member who was in any way associated with the African trade. Although they were fairly isolated as political actors, Quakers slowly reached out to other Protestant religious denominations, particularly Methodists, and gradually many religious leaders embraced abolitionism on strictly moral grounds. In 1783, the first formal petition to the British House of Commons was presented by Quaker activists, calling for the abolition of the slave trade. And it was then that the organized political campaign to ending slavery and slaving began. The British Prime Minister, as to be expected, expressed some sympathy, but little less. In 1787, London Quakers formed an official anti-slavery organization, the London Abolition Committee, which included Anglican evangelicals. By the early 1790s, some representatives of Parliament were members of the sympathizers of the Abolition Committee, which had begun a successful public campaign to spread anti-slave trade ideas. These ideas were passed around in pamphlets and were published and distributed, and sympathizers outside of London were approached, principally within Methodist churches with significant urban working class members, and anti-slavery preaching was pursued to build support, and a fairly impressive campaign of presenting petitions to Parliament asking for the slave trade's abolition was undertaken. Far from an elite movement of religious leaders, British anti-slave trade sentiment grew very quickly among common people associated with Protestant denominations, and abolitionism became a veritable mass social movement as Britain's role in the African trade became widely discussed in public issue throughout the nation. In 1792, over 500 anti-slavery petitions were presented to the British Parliament, containing an astounding 400,000 signatures, representing about 9% of the total British adult population. The drafting of these petitions and the gathering of signatures were made possible with the cooperation of churches as well as provincial and city governments throughout the nation. This developing mass abolitionist movement had a profound impact upon British politicians. In the same year, the House of Commons passed a law gradually outlawing the slave trade, although it wasn't approved by the House of Lords. Within 10 years of the issue of slaving having been transformed from an external concern championed by Quakers and other religious organizations into a social and political movement that carried over to the nation's centers of political power. Although the crisis produced by the French Revolution and the onset of the Napoleonic Wars temporarily reduced national attention to the issue of African slave trade, in 1807, Britain, along with the United States, formally ended participation in slaving as of January 1st, 1808. A somewhat parallel process of building support for anti-slave trade measures developed in the future United States before the Revolutionary War. While the Revolution interrupted anti-slaving religious activities, the founding of the Republic based on a concept that all men were created equal led to a renewed look at slavery. Abolition societies within the Quaker leadership were formed in Pennsylvania, where a gradual emancipation law had been passed in 1780, and in New York City as well. Petitions were sent to the new Congress in 1783 to abolish the African slave trade. But the issue of slavery waned, and in the context of a revolutionary government that was occupied with the monumental task of creating strong political structures for the new nation. The central issue faced by the United States was the need to form a strong national government in the face of insistence by individual states and sectional interests on the maintaining of independent power and authority. Anti-slavery sentiment was an aspect of the victorious American Revolution, but it did not produce a mass political movement focusing upon slaving or slavery, as was the case in Great Britain in the 1780s and 1790s. U.S. merchants and maritime interests played a marginal role in the African slave trade compared to the British, and perhaps because of this, the moral objection to slaving was not as intense in the United States. Additionally, While the new republic and its revolutionary constitution protected the rights of slaveholders and sanctioned slavery, a 1794 law prohibited U.S. citizens from participating in the slave trade with foreign nations. By 1798, a full decade before 1808, when the Anglo-American treaty banning the slave trade took effect, all states had made it illegal to import foreign slaves. There was also a fundamentally different character to anti-slavery and anti-slavery issues in the United States compared to Great Britain. In the United States, these issues were rapidly secularized after the Revolutionary victory and independence. Religious leaders in Britain led a moral crusade, were successful at building a mass movement, and then enlisted political support in the Parliament. The process in the United States was entirely different. Slavery and slaving quickly became a political rather than religious or strictly moral issue in the independent United States, and were debated by government officials at all levels. Local, state, and national Quakers who had raised these issues during the colonial period were delegitimized in the short term because they had not supported the Revolutionary War, and this very fact marginalized their activities and influence after independence. Additionally, slavery was entrenched in the southern states, and this gave rise to a powerful pro-slavery lobby that prevented the activities of abolitionists and weakened their mass appeal at national level. Despite strong support in the northern states, where slavery was gradually ended, the power of the southern states in the national government was so strong that every attempt to pass legislation limiting slavery was decisively defeated in the first 2 decades of the Republic's history. In 1808, a ban on the slave trade effectively diminished slaving as a political or moral issue of widespread popular concern in the United States. And in the question of slavery itself did not take hold on any significant scale among the general public in the early 19th century, despite the continued but weakened activities of abolitionists. The new republic had other concerns, and the territorial expansion westward produced heated political debates about whether slavery should be permitted in the new territories, soon to become states, rather than about whether slavery should be definitively abolished. Abolitionism would be a minor force in U.S. politics until the 1830s, when it was revived. No such pro-slavery political forces existed in Great Britain, and when the slave trade was abolished and a sustained campaign was undertaken to end the African slave trade conducted by other nations, using diplomatic pressure, and a series of treaties were negotiated or imposed upon Spain, Portugal, and Brazil, as I mentioned. The treaties not only aimed at forcing these nations to end the participation in the slave trade, but also stipulated that British warships would be granted permission to stop and search suspected slave ships anywhere on the high seas. In 1819, the African Squadron of the British Navy was established to patrol the African coast in search of slave ships, which, if discovered, would be seized, their slaves freed, and their crews arrested. Special admiralty courts were established in British colonial Freetown, in Sierra Leone, Havana, Rio de Janeiro, and in Dutch-controlled Paramaribo in Suriname. This became known as the Courts of Mixed Commission, since they were to be comprised of citizens of the nations that had signed the anti-slave trade treaties, and Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Each of these countries was pressured to form its own anti-slavery naval squadron, obviously controlled by the British. The mixed commissions were to adjudicate cases involving seized slave ships. Additionally, the British Foreign Office created a slave trade department to oversee the enforcement of treaties, the activities of African Squadron, and the mixed commission courts. So the British led a broad-sided attack on the slave trade that was to play out in different phases over the next 50 years, until Cuba was finally forced to halt African imports in 1867. Throughout this period, over 570 slave ships were seized by naval squadrons, and more than 150,000 slaves were freed. The attack on the slave trade in the first half of the 19th century was a British-led endeavor, although there were varying degrees of support in other European nations and in the United States, since the United States had abolished the trade in 1808 and was not dependent on the importation of African slaves because of the impressive process of natural reproduction among its slave population. Slaving receded as a political cause of great significance. The issue of the African slave trade was of critical political and economic importance in Spanish Cuba and Portuguese Brazil, and then after 1822, independent Brazil. However, this was not because the rising anti-slave trade sentiment, but rather the opposite. Far from opposing the slave trade, elites in both countries were dependent upon and in favor of continued slaving, and there were no popular-based movements of anti-slavery sentiment of any significance. Brazil and Cuba experienced dynamic economic growth based around economic slavery, sectors that grew with slave labor during the first half of the 19th century and needed the continued importation of Africans to maintain labor supplies, not caring about the theoretical illegality of the slave trade. So there was a lot of smuggling going on of slaves. While abolitionism was destined to become a powerful political force in the United States during the 1830s, it would take hold much later in the 19th century in Cuba and in Brazil, and would never become the religious, civic, and political movement that it became in the North American world. There were no Protestant denominations such as the Quakers or the Methodists working to mobilize popular support for abolition in Cuba, Brazil, or Portugal, or Spain. Nor was there widespread sympathy for abolition among the political elites in colonial Cuba or imperial Brazil, since so many powerful public figures were slaveholders whose economic lifelines were linked directly or indirectly to slavery. Additionally, slavery was pervasive in nearly every region of Brazil and Cuba. There were no areas similar to the northern free states of the United States where abolitionists could establish a base of support. Paralleling the united attack on the slave trade, British anti-slavery activists turned to the issue of complete abolition in the West Indian colonies. In 1823, the London Anti-Slavery Committee was formed. Although there was little initial success at mobilizing mass public support for abolition, for a variety of complex reasons having to do with internal British politics, this situation quickly changed during the early 1830s. A slave uprising in Jamaica in 1831, its violent repression and persecution launched against abolitionist missionaries that were residing on the island became public issues of importance within Great Britain. In the aftermath of the revolt, the anti-slavery committee's call for immediate emancipation found supporters within the nation's political elite. And by 1833, key politicians had begun to focus upon the abolition of slavery. The Emancipation Act freeing all slaves in British colonies was passed by Parliament and signed into law by the King in August 1833. It called for immediate freedom for slaves, although an apprenticeship system was established that permitted slave owners to use the labor of ex-slaves for 6 years while they were being prepared for freedom. So similar to what happened in Cuba, right? You're going to get freed, but you're going to have to keep working. With the secularization of the abolition as a political issue in the United States, the ending of the slave trade in 1808, the pro-slavery offensive by Southern politicians, and the resulting decay of abolitionism as a potent political force by the second decade of the 19th century, anti-slavery activists readjusted their tactics and strategies. Evangelical Protestants and Quakers continued to preach against the evils and the sins of slavery, but outside of churches and small group sympathizers, their impact on the general public was minimal. Some focused upon strategies for manumitting slaves. Others developed colonization schemes for creating areas within the United States for freed slaves, or even developing colonies for manumitted slaves in Africa, particularly in Sierra Leone, where British abolitionists had established a colonization project. In 1817, the American Colonization Society was founded, advocating gradual emancipation and a return to Africa for freedmen and women. There was some support from anti-slavery elements in the North and even in the slaveholding South, but it was marginal at best. It was only in the 1830s that abolitionism was revived in the United States. This was preceded by a movement of religious revivalism that swept the nation, known as the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening had taken place during the colonial period from the 1730s through the 1770s and was led by the New England Baptists and Presbyterians in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. This movement of religious enthusiasm also swept through Great Britain and other parts of Northern Europe, where Protestantism was entrenched. In some ways, it was designed to counter the growing influence of rationalism and scientific reasoning and the threats that these Enlightenment ideas pose to religious doctrines, especially the fundamental notion of the need for salvation through allegiance to an all-powerful God. While historians have debated the influence of this religious revivalism on the American Revolution, it is clear that the revolutionary period interrupted the movement of religious fervor sweeping the colonies. But after independence in 1790s, there was a gradual renewal of evangelical Protestantism, especially Calvinism, with its emphasis on salvation as determined more by inner faith and moral righteousness in one's life and less as a predetermined condition in the hands of the Almighty God. These religious ideas made possible an agreement between the secular democratic political ideals that are in part shaped the new United States and the religious piety of common people, who could conceive of a democratic ability to achieve salvation through their moral actions, life decisions, and free will. Although the revivalism began in New England, it gradually swept through the mid-Atlantic states to the southern frontiers and westward toward the new territories that were being stolen violently from the indigenous people. It also began to spread among newly arriving immigrant groups who were courted by evangelicals. Although abolitionism had never disappeared from the agendas of many religious and political leaders, it was reborn as a popular movement in the 1830s, in part because of the moral righteousness caused by the religious revivalism of the early 19th century and the conviction that slavery was a sin standing in the way of personal and national salvation. Anti-slavery sentiment was revitalized as a powerful religious, social, political movement that would shape American political debates until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. In 1831, the Boston journalist William Lloyd Garrison established a newspaper, The Liberator, dedicated to the immediate abolition of slavery. And the following year, he helped found the New England Anti-Slavery Society. An anti-slavery society had been formed in New York in 1831, and in 1833, abolitionist groups came together in Philadelphia to organize the national-level American Anti-Slavery Society, which adopted the position that slavery should be abolished immediately. Abolitionists had previously endorsed gradual emancipation, and some supported the colonization schemes mentioned previously. Now, the issue was framed in the moralistic and religious terms of revivalism and regeneration, but the objective was political as well. For the sake of the nation's salvation, the sin of slavery had to be ended. Using churches to spread their message to the common people, organizing lecture tours organized to further their cause, and printing and mailing pamphlets, magazine articles, and journalistic pieces to be read by the increasingly literate public. The society had some 200,000 members and 2,000 local organizations by 1840. Free peoples of color in the northern states were active participants, and 6 African Americans were on the organization's original board of managers. Ex-slaves who had acquired freedom and also became important activists in the organization. The most famous was Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave who had acquired freedom in the North, and who was electrified the public with his eloquent testimony during the 1840 and 1850s on the barbarity of slavery in the South. Remember, this is a person we talked about with Professor Michaels, okay? So if you want to check that out, go back to first course 4 and 5. He's in there talking about Frederick Douglass. There were divisions over the strategy and tactics, splits between different religious denominations, and a pro-slavery backlash both in the North and especially in the South, where proselytizers attempted to spread anti-slavery message in the heart of the slave states. Mobs were often organized to attack speakers violently, and was the case with any controversial issue. There was sharp polarization among the public in the ever-expanding United States. While there was no direct march of anti-slavery sentiment in the nation up to the eve of the Civil War, the issue was eventually adopted and addressed by all political parties. In 1840, the abolitionists organized the Liberty Party, which was the first formal national-level political party dedicated to ending slavery, and this was its single issue. It was a fringe party drawing sub 3% of the national vote in 1844 presidential election. But its participation marks the formal entrance of the abolitionism into national politics. And in 1848, after the invasion of Mexico and the seizure of about one half of Mexican national territory in the Mexican-American War, which took place from 1846 to 1848, a new political party was founded, the Free Soil Party. Anti-slavery forces in the mainstream Democratic and Whig parties, as well as members of the defunct Liberty Party, formed the Free Soil Party, which called for the forbidding of slavery in the newly acquired Western territories, transferred to the United States through the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, a treaty forced upon Mexico to end the military occupation of that nation by the United States. The issue of extending slavery into new territories and future states led to the secession of the southern states, the formation of the Confederacy, the cataclysmic Civil War, and the end of slavery in the United States. Dating from the early years of the Republic, 2 general laws governing slavery in territories extending to the Mississippi River were passed by Congress in 1780s. The Northwest Ordinance of 1784 prohibited the extension of slavery north of the Ohio River, and the Southwest Ordinance of 1787 permitted slavery in the territories south of the same river. These were attempts to resolve potential regional rivalries even before slavery was abolished in all of the northern United States. The issue surfaced again after the unanticipated acquisition of all territory north and east of pre-1848 Mexico to the Pacific Ocean through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 from the Napoleonic France. Perhaps because of these areas were so sparsely populated and because the future impact of the acquisition was not yet fully understood, the question of slavery in the newly acquired West was not addressed or resolved. However, in 1819, when the Missouri Territory petitioned for statehood, slavery in the territories once again became a controversial political issue, pitting southern and northern sectional interests against one another. Most of the Missouri settlers had originated in the southern slave states, and many had brought slaves with them. Yet when the statehood issue came up in Congress, the House of Representatives included the banning of future slave imports and gradual freedom for all slaves born in Missouri as condition for entrance into the Union. The Senate refused to vote favorably on these stipulations, and after an angry and bitter debate, a pact known as the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was finally reached. This permitted slavery in the state of Missouri, but permanently banned slavery in all future states north of the southern Missouri boundary. Essentially, a north-south line governing the future of U.S. slavery was extended westward from the Mississippi River, and this conformed to the ordinances of 1784 and 1787. However, most territory included in the Louisiana Purchase was actually north of the southern Missouri boundary, and in many ways the compromise was interpreted in both the North and the South as a victory of anti-slavery forces. Nevertheless, the issue of slavery's extension into the West nearly disappeared as a decisive national political concern until the annexation of Texas in 1845. The passionate anti-slavery rhetoric heard during the debates leading to the 1820 Compromise had a lasting effect on the Southern politicians who were concerned about the possibility of an eventual all-out Northern-led campaign against slavery. In the context of the anti-slavery religious revivalism sweeping through the northern states, the increasing polarization of Southern pro-slavery and Northern anti-slavery sectional interests, and the annexation of Western and Southwestern regions of the continent, the issue of slavery was once more again placed at the forefront and center in the national political debates during the 1840s. Although the Missouri Compromise had theoretically settled the question of slavery's extension into the new territories, the petition of Texas to be admitted into the Union as a slave state resurrected the heated debate. Texas had been part of the southern tier migration westward and became a major producer of cotton based on slave labor. Part of Mexican national territory, but sparsely populated and militarily indefensible, Texas won its independence from Mexico in 1836 and immediately petitioned for annexation to the United States as a slave state. For a variety of reasons, including fear of war with Mexico and undefined western Texas frontier, the opposition of northern anti-slavery interests, who felt that the balance of power would shift to the slave states and international pressures, Texas was not made part of the United States until 1845, when it was admitted to the Union with slavery legally sanctioned. This was the first step salvo in the renewed conflict over the extension of slavery in the territories, and it would eventually lead to the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. The rapid settlement of California following discovery of gold in 1848, the adoption of the state's anti-slavery constitution, and 1849 petition for California to become incorporated into the Union as a free state continued to place the issue of slavery's role in the territories at the forefront of the political stage. After the war with Mexico, Southern sectional interests were clearly threatened because of an aggressive attempt by anti-slavery sectors of Congress to completely ban slavery from the huge western regions that were formally annexed in 1848. A crisis was avoided by yet another brokered deal, the Compromise of 1850. In a series of laws passed by Congress, California was admitted as a free state, but it was agreed that the issue of slavery in other, still sparsely populated territories would be decided at a later date when statehood was petitioned. Slavery was not specifically forbidden in these new territories to appease the South. As a further concession to Southern interests, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was enacted. This made Northern federal authorities responsible for apprehending suspected runaway slaves and returning them to their rightful owners. Law enforcement officials were also obliged to cooperate with agents who had been dispatched to the north by Southern slaveholders to recapture runaways. For Northern anti-slavery activists, these were grave blows. The Southern pro-slavery interests had forced the federal government to make complicity with slavery in the free states obligatory by law under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Act. Although the conflicts over slavery's extension into the western United States were secular and political, the anti-slavery movements appeared to common people had for the most part been based on religious and moral arguments. The role of Protestant denominations, particularly Methodists, in spreading the abolitionist gospel had been central. Yet, there had always been a secular strain to the anti-slavery movement. And with the conflicts of the late 1840s over the extension of slavery westward, political considerations among the abolitionists began to move to center stage in their campaign to build unpopular support. The United States had been transformed during the first half of the 19th century by migration and westward expansion. Large-scale immigration from Europe and rapid industrialization in the north. Urbanization, the growth of an urban working class, and dynamic population growth, among other factors. One factor of the abolitionist movement realized that slavery would be ended only if the appeal of anti-slavery forces broadened and moved away from strictly religious principles. The debates about the extension of slavery into the territories were largely political. And if slavery was ever to be abolished, a broad secular political base of support that could push the nation toward abolition would have to be constructed. During the 1850s,